Alright, today we're talking about one of the hardest hits the Continental Army took in the Revolutionary War, the capture of Fort Washington on November 16, 1776. Picture it. George Washington and his troops have been on the defensive since the Battle of Long Island, trying to hold their ground in New York. The stakes are high, morale is on the line, and Washington's whole strategy is on the verge of crumbling. This isn't just another battle, it's a brutal turning point. So, let's rewind a bit to understand why Fort Washington was such a big deal. After the British stomped through Long Island, Washington was desperate to keep a foothold in New York. Fort Washington was strategically placed on the high ground of Manhattan, overlooking the Hudson River, and it was a fortress the Americans were banking on to stop the British from fully controlling New York. But here's the catch. Washington's position in New York was a risky one. His forces were spread thin, supplies were low, and morale? Let's just say it wasn't great. Washington had already been advised by some of his generals to abandon Fort Washington and regroup elsewhere, but he decided to hold on to it as long as possible. Little did he know, the British were preparing to launch an all-out assault that would test the strength and the spirit of the Continental Army. Now we're at November 16, 1776, the day everything went down. British General William Howe has got his sights locked on Fort Washington, and he's coming in with a force of about 8,000 troops, while the Americans have only around 3,000 soldiers defending the fort under Colonel Robert Magaw. The British attack starts with artillery pounding the fort, shaking the very ground beneath the defenders' feet. Then, Howe's troops charge from all sides, pressing in on the Americans with brutal efficiency. The Hessians, German mercenaries fighting for the British, storm the fort with bayonets, showing no mercy. Magaw and his men fight back hard, knowing there's no easy way out. The scene is absolute chaos. Soldiers are firing from all directions, the noise is deafening, and the air's thick with smoke and fear. The fall of Fort Washington wasn't just a tactical loss, it was a major psychological hit for the entire revolution. Imagine being part of Washington's army at that time. You've just seen one of your strongest defensive positions crumble. Thousands of fellow soldiers are either dead or captured, and now the British are on a winning streak. Washington himself was shattered, questioning his decisions and facing the hard reality that the war might not turn in his favor. Strategically, losing Fort Washington also meant that the British now had a chokehold on New York. They had effectively split the colonies, controlling the Hudson River, which made it much harder for Washington to maneuver. This defeat forced Washington to rethink his whole approach. The revolution was going to need more than just head-on fights. It would need cunning, resilience, and maybe even some unconventional tactics to survive. The capture of Fort Washington showed Washington and his officers that traditional defenses and set-piece battles weren't going to win this war. It was a wake-up call, a brutal reminder that they were up against one of the best-trained armies in the world. This defeat made Washington change tactics, pushing him to rely more on guerrilla-style warfare, hit-and-run tactics, and avoiding direct confrontations with the British wherever possible. Fort Washington's fall also had a ripple effect across the colonies. News of the loss shook the morale of the Patriot cause, but it also inspired some to rally around the need for independence with more urgency. The revolution was in a precarious place, and while some were discouraged, others became even more determined to see it through. In the long run, the capture of Fort Washington set the stage for a war of attrition, where Washington's strategy became one of survival and resilience rather than immediate victory. Today, the fall of Fort Washington is remembered as a pivotal moment in the Revolutionary War, a brutal reminder of how close the American cause came to collapse. Fort Washington symbolizes both the vulnerability and the resilience of the Continental Army. It's a story of courage against impossible odds, a lesson in the harsh realities of war, and a turning point that forced the revolution to adapt and evolve. While the fort itself may have fallen, the spirit of those who fought there endured. The soldiers who held Fort Washington to the bitter end are remembered as some of the toughest fighters of the Revolutionary War, men who stood their ground knowing they were outnumbered and outgunned, but refusing to give up without a fight. Their sacrifice became a rallying cry, reminding future generations that freedom comes at a high cost. So, what's the big takeaway from the capture of Fort Washington? It's this. Sometimes, the toughest losses are the ones that teach us the most. The defeat at Fort Washington showed Washington that he couldn't rely on conventional tactics alone. It forced him to think outside the box, to find new ways to fight, and to never underestimate the grit of his men, even in the face of overwhelming odds. The capture of Fort Washington was a dark day for the Continental Army, but it was also a turning point that transformed the Revolution. Washington and his army learned that survival wasn't about winning every battle. It was about finding the strength to keep going, to adapt, and to fight for another chance. This story of resilience, sacrifice, and determination is a reminder of just how far people will go when they believe in something bigger than themselves. And in the end, that belief is what kept the revolution alive.